Hey, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. If you're new here, my name is Satya. I'm a documentary and portrait photographer based in London, and I make videos on YouTube about photography, filmmaking, and creative journey. And this is a conversation with series. This is the second episode of that series. I took a bit of a break from it, but I'm keen on making more of these sit down conversations, in depth conversations with artists that I admire. And I'm glad to be back with this specific interview because Alys is a photographer I've been admiring for so long. And she's one of the main reasons why I started shooting portraiture, and her work is truly inspiring and exhibits different levels of creative thinking and exploration of human experience as well. And yeah, we talk about her journey into photography, photo books, process around her personal work, funding for personal work, her documentary film, Mother Vera, and also her current project that she's been working on in Italy. On the note of her documentary film, Mother Vera, we didn't know this at the time of recording, but now we know that the British Film Institute's film festival that happened this year in October, Mother Vera has won the best documentary for this year, which is great news. I think the award was called Grierson Award. But yeah, it's great news for the team, and I'm super excited and happy for them, and can't wait to watch it. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into the conversation. If you are listening to this on YouTube Music, please turn on the video if you can, because I'll be sharing Alys's work as we move through the conversation, from her photo books, from her personal works at the moment, and also some clips from her documentary as well. But yeah, let's get into it. Alys, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
It's a pleasure.
Could you please give us a brief overview of how you got into photography and a bit of your journey through where you are now?
That could be a very long answer.
Could be however long you want it to be.
So I'm Alys Tomlinson and I'm London based, and I've been working as a photographer probably for about 20 years now. I started off, so I studied English literature and film.
Yeah.
So I wasn't someone who kind of from the age of 2, always knew I was going to be a photographer like some people do.
Right.
But I always had a real interest in, I suppose, visual language,
Right.
in film, and in particularly cinematography and photography. But I think partly my upbringing, my family are quite academic. So although they're creative in an academic way, I wasn't brought up with like a potter as a mother and a sculptor as a father. It wasn't like a classically artist-led family.
Right.
Although I was always very much encouraged to be curious and educate myself. So I wasn't, photography wasn't, I suppose, a natural place for me to go. But when I was at university, I went to Leeds to do literature and film, and I did a evening class there, kind of a City and Guilds evening class.
Right.
And I was in the dark room a lot, and I was photographing with just a 35mm camera that my dad had given me years ago when I was a teenager. And I really got into it, and I really enjoyed the process, and I found it like quite addictive actually.
Right.
But still at that point, I think I didn't really see it as a kind of career option. And then I started working for the student paper when I was at Leeds. They had a really good student paper called I think it was called the Leeds Student. But there's something good about being a student, which is that actually people can be much more responsive to you kind of approaching them. So they used to get really great like actors and writers. So I remember when I was about 18, Irvin Welsh had just had the book Trainspotting out, which obviously became a massive success.
Right.
And, I don't know if he was giving kind of interviews to all the like nationals, but he was very keen to like be featured by the Leeds Student. He was almost more kind of receptive to being approached and more supportive of like the kind of young student population. So I remember, for instance, doing a portrait shoot with him.
Right.
And then I kind of thought, I quite enjoy this. It's quite challenging. So I got sent on lots of kind of assignments for the student paper. And then when I finished, I didn't really know what to do.
Yeah.
Because I suppose when you study humanities, and in a sense, it gives you freedom, but it's not like studying, engineering or something that gives you a particular career path. And at that point, I was still really interested in film. So I actually went and did an internship in New York for a film production company.
In New York?
Yeah, so I went to New York. But while I was there, I was doing a lot of black and white street photography with my 35mm like Pentax, like film photography, which I really enjoyed. And I noticed that TimeOut, which was a big magazine at that point, had just launched in New York. And I got in touch with them very boldly and kind of sent them a portfolio of prints that I'd done of street photography. And I was also doing a bit of writing then. So I said to them, I'm living in New York now. Do you have any interest in, you know, it was quite bold actually, I probably wouldn't do that now, employing me as a writer or a photographer. And they got back to me and said, well, we don't have any kind of openings for writing. My writing probably wasn't very good, to be fair, but we do need someone to take all the photographs for the new Time Out guide to New York. And I was like,
nice.
Wow, because this was like my first foray into any kind of assignment or professional photography.
Right.
But it was kind of what I was already doing. So I got this huge picture list, and over several months, I got to know New York incredibly well.
Yeah.
The boroughs, of outer boroughs, trips out of town. I photographed the entire guide. Then I came back to London. I continued to work for Time Out, and that's when I studied photography more formally at Central St Martin's College of Art. And then for probably about 10 to 15 years, I did many of the travel guides for Time Out. So I would travel to cities, they were all Europe and North America, but it was a great kind of apprenticeship or training really, because I had to be very independent, I had to be very adventurous, I had to be very organised, I had to make the best out of difficult situations. So it was a really good kind of entry into the photography world. So that's a rather long answer, but
no, that's very interesting. I mean, that's a big name to jump in.
Yeah, they kind of took a chance on me because I had nothing in terms of a CV, but I put together this portfolio, a kind of 10 by 8. I think they were handprints at that point because I was working in the darkroom in New York.
Right.
And I printed them myself, and I guess they kind of saw something in the photography.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was terrible pay, so they probably couldn't have got anyone who was super experienced to do it, but I was like, I couldn't believe it when they called me up and gave me this job.
Yeah.
It was like my dream assignment. So
wow, that's amazing. And for this assignment, were you shooting film or were you
all film? It was before digital was even really being used. So it was all black and white film and colour transparency.
Wow.
And for the colour transparency, obviously, there's very little latitude. So you had to it was very good training in terms of making the correct exposures and being very careful with exposures. Yeah, it was probably about 10 years after I started that they then said, actually, we want everything on digital now. So I shot film for many, many, many years.
So from there, doing the work with magazine and travel guide photography, were they like landscape, cityscapes, or did you do portraits as well?
I did everything. So I would get a huge picture list at the beginning of each kind of assignment, and it was divided into the kind of chapters of the travel guide. So it would be like restaurants, bars, shops, the outer boroughs, trips out of town, sightseeing. So for instance, if I had to go to a restaurant, they didn't just want a picture of an empty restaurant. So I would maybe photograph the chef, or I would photograph some food.
Right.
If I had to go to a hotel, they didn't just want a kind of lobby with no one in it. So I would try and find an interesting angle. Maybe they had a pool. It was quite a lot. I mean, I was kind of left to my own devices. There was no real kind of creative guidance, I suppose. But it made you work and kind of think really carefully about each shot and try and make the kind of the best of each situation, I suppose. So so each guide would take, I mean, New York took months, but when I did guides after that, I'd normally go for about a month to each city.
Right.
Yeah, so it was a lot of work, and every day I'd be out there with my camera, with my backpack, like walking the streets and then kind of crossing things off the list as I did it. So it was a mix of portraits, landscapes, streetscapes, interiors, exteriors. So it was very good training in becoming a kind of all-round photographer, I guess, particularly in that kind of editorial field, magazine work.
Do you still do commercial work? Or
I do, but I do less of it, and that's partly through choice, because probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I decided to kind of I made a decision that I wanted to focus more on personal projects, because up until that point I'd been very busy. So actually the Time Out led to more travel guides, it led to more magazine work, kind of agency work for design agencies, a bit of advertising. And at one point I was extremely busy and I just didn't really have the capacity or the headspace to think about my own personal projects. I'd end up kind of starting personal projects and then never finishing them, which is quite common. But it became like a little bit frustrating. And then several years ago, I'd started this project about pilgrimage, which became a project called Voto.
Right.
And I decided, okay, I really need to kind of go for this and invest in it fully. And that's when I did an MA in anthropology at SOAS in London, which was the anthropology of pilgrimage, which tied in with this long-term project. So I really went for it in a way and really kind of invested in it. Yeah, on an emotional level, financial level, it wasn't cheap doing an MA. I ended up writing my dissertation about Lourdes, which was a big part of my pilgrimage project. So it all tied together. So I made a decision to move, I suppose, away from commercial work. But still, I do assignments today because that's how I survive. That's how I make a living. So I don't do as many as I used to. And I suppose I've taken, I've kind of taken a hit, if you like, financially, because I'm just not doing as much work. But there's also not as much work out there. So the industry's really shifted in those years. So I suppose the short answer is I still do commercial work and I use the money I get from commercial work to fund my own projects because it's very, very hard to get funding for long term.
Right. So you funded yourself. You don't get funding from...
There's very little funding. I mean, I've won a couple of big prizes, like the Sony Photographer of the Year Award, the Taylor Wessing Prize, which came with a cash prize.
Right.
But I, in some ways I got lucky to win them. You can't rely on getting an income from prizes.
Yeah. No, of course not.
I mean, it's very small chance you're ever going to be successful, really. So I got a bit of money from that. But like Arts Council, I've applied for twice recently. I didn't get it. And there's just very little. There's a few independent foundations, but there's very, very few options for funding now. So yeah, it's very, very hard to get any funding in the UK anyway. I mean, I think like some maybe other European countries are better. In America, they have the Guggenheim Fellowship, which they award to many US photographers every year. So they have different systems. So I think in other countries it might be, and it's never easy, but it might be slightly easier. But in the UK, it's very hard.
Why do you think that is?
There's been huge cuts to the creative industries and to the arts in recent years. Like that's a large part of it. Living in London, especially with things like the Arts Council, it's always more competitive because there's more people trying to get the grants in London. I think there's a variety of reasons. I mean, I don't think we invest nearly, considering how buoyant it can be for our economy, like the governments do not choose to invest in arts in the way that I feel they should. And that's why it's becoming increasingly hard to make it as an artist. Like studio rents are going up, they're being sold off for like real estate or fancy apartments. So, I mean, it's the same narrative in many cities, like same in Berlin, same in New York, but it does feel like a particularly hard time to kind of be an artist, I suppose, at the moment.
That's fair. It does seem like, I mean, from my conversations with photographers in the US and listening to other podcasts where photographers are being interviewed, there does seem to be a lot more funding opportunities, at least in the States.
Kind of more private funding, or there's more foundations as well. So there's more kind of independent foundations, maybe patrons like that you can kind of tap into. Here, it's kind of mostly public funding, and that's there's very little of it.
That's fair. You mentioned Taylor Wessing. Was that for last summer?
So the Taylor Wessing Photographic Portrait Prize was for my project last summer, which was a project, I suppose it was kind of my COVID project. Not that I really want to call it that. But I don't know if you've seen...
I did. I that was my introduction to your work. And in many ways, I think that book, your book, pushed me to try portrait photography. Until that point, I was only shooting landscapes and cityscapes, and I saw your work, and that's something I wanted to try to do. So yeah, I have you to thank for that.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, because that is very different to your previous project, Voto, which was...
I mean, it's still shot on large format in black and white.
Right. No, I didn't mean the medium itself, but the subject and the theme of it.
Sure. Yeah.
How do you... I'm sure you have a process where there are a lot of ideas that come your way, and how do they trickle down to becoming a project for you?
Well, last summer was quite interesting because I never kind of set out to do that project. That came about as a result of the pandemic. So Voto was my big project about pilgrimage, which actually took about 5 years in total, resulted in a book, but it was a long project. It took me 5 years. I did an MA in anthropology during that time. I probably went to Lourdes, which was one of the big locations of the project, 8 to 10 times. The project didn't work for about 3 years. I kept going. I mean, that was a struggle. It was a real struggle. It wasn't something that I just went off for 2 weeks, came back and had this like fantastic body of work. It was really hard. It didn't work. I was shooting in colour, medium format initially.
Right.
I was spending way too much money visiting these pilgrimage sites and kind of thinking, what on earth am I doing here? I nearly gave up with it many times. So there was something with that project that kept kind of drawing me back. And I think also because I'd invested in this MA in anthropology, I felt, no, I've got to make this work. There's something here. And that was an example of when I switched to large format that everything kind of came together with that project, because it demanded a slow approach. It demanded a thoughtful approach. It required you to be very precise, and actually that kind of reflected this notion of pilgrimage as well, of like searching for a higher being, of this kind of meditative state. So it very much suited that project, and my kind of breakthrough moment in that project was when I went to large format. But that was very much a project ex voto, where I would go on trips at certain times, and that would be my time to make personal work. The kind of Taylor Wessing project that you're referring to, which became Lost Summer, was something that I never expected to make, because I feel that I work better on personal projects when I'm kind of away from home, when I'm in a different city, when I'm very focused on, that's all I'm focused on, making the work. It's much harder to do that in your home city, when you've got so many distractions going on, and you've got a new electricity bill to pay, and and then I don't know, I've got to then look after my niece and do childcare, things kind of happen that you're not expecting. When I'm away, I feel like I'm much more focused. What happened with Lost Summer was that I was actually at that point about to start a new project, which came a project called Gli Isolani, which is my latest book, all about ritual and tradition and identity on Italian islands. But with COVID, of course, and the pandemic, everything was cancelled. So these festivities and celebrations that I was planning to explore for my new project weren't happening anymore, and you couldn't travel. So I kind of was like, okay, I'm stuck at home, as we all are. This is a really tough time for everyone. I'm not feeling very productive, because the projects I wanted to work on, I can't work on. I want to keep making photographs, and what do I do? Didn't really have many ideas at that point, wasn't hugely inspired. And then I started talking to some of my friends who have got like teenage children, and they were saying to me how hard it was for their kids, because of course everything had been cancelled. Their exams had been cancelled. They were no longer at school. They were kind of stuck in their bedrooms. They had this kind of boredom that had set in. They didn't feel like they had a purpose anymore. It was very difficult. And I started thinking, God, that would be really strange, because when I was a teenager, there were all these kind of rites of passage that you have. You have school, and then you leave school and everyone signs their shirts. And then I didn't exactly have a prom, but there was like a leaving do. And, you have your exams, and then you celebrate after your exam. So there are all these moments that I suppose didn't exist in that time. So then I kind of had this idea. I thought, well, why don't I speak to some of these kids or teenagers, and maybe I could photograph them in what they would have worn to prom. So that's why it became Lost Summer, because they'd lost their summer. So I thought, well, why don't I photograph them in all kind of dressed up for the prom that had, was not going to happen. So in a way, there was a kind of, sadness and a melancholy to this. So I started off by photographing my friend's my friend's daughter and her boyfriend at the time. Loads of them are couples. They've all broken up by now, because they were all like 16, 17, in my friend's garden. So the idea was, this was when rules had relaxed a little bit, so you were allowed to see people in small groups outside. And I kind of turned up, and I remember my friend's daughter Nancy had this like beautiful kind of satin dress that her mum had worn. I think it was her mum's wedding dress. And then Jack, the guy, her boyfriend at the time, had this tuxedo, and they've held themselves. They were very kind of confident and quite kind of proud in a way, even though I was photographing them for something that wasn't happening. So there was something kind of quite resilient about them still, definitely. So I took some shots on large format camera in the garden. The idea was that the garden acted as a kind of environmental backdrop or environmental studio. So it was almost like I'd set up a studio shot, but I was instead of using a colorama, or I was using, leaves or trees, so the idea was that partly because all these well, we'd all really been dependent on these outdoor spaces
Right.
as some kind of comfort during this time, that it made sense to photograph them in these outdoor spaces. So I did that shoot, and I was quite happy with what I got back, and there was a kind of strength to them that I really thought was interesting. So that project, then I spent the entire summer, well, it was only 3 months actually,
Right.
but in my neighbourhood. So they were all taken within walking distance of my
Right.
flat. So I would make kind of appointments with these teenagers, often by like WhatsApp, and I'd photograph someone, and then they'd say, "Oh, you should photograph my sister, or you should photograph my friend from school." So
Nice.
it became this kind of network of North London teenagers, and it was really important to me. Of course, I live in a really diverse area, so it was important that there was a diversity to the people I was photographing in terms of ethnicity, in terms of class. Like some were at really posh private schools, others were at the local state schools, and one kind of led to another, I suppose. And by the end of the summer, so I started in June, I shot June, July and August, and then they started going back to school in September. The schools reopened.
Right.
So at that point I thought, okay, this is a natural end to the project.
Right.
But that was a really good example, I suppose, of finding an interesting story kind of on your doorstep or in your neighbourhood. So it kind of taught me that I don't have to jump on a plane to make work, although I am more focused when I do that. And of course, it was such a bizarre time during the pandemic that actually that gave me something to very much kind of focus my time on. And that was also quite interesting, that project, in terms of a kind of editing point of view for me, because I ended up photographing 44 teenagers over 3 months. And that's the first time like I've taken 44 portraits, for instance, and everyone is in the project. So I didn't edit out. There was no one I photographed who I didn't include in the, for instance, the book that was published, that I self-published, or the project overall, because it just felt that they'd been through this incredibly hard time. And it was really, even though some portraits are stronger than others, it was really important to me that everyone was treated equally, and that I kind of recognised what each of those individuals had been through. So it was the first time, that I hadn't kind of edited anyone out of a project, I suppose. And also with the cost of large format film, I was photographing, I did 4 sheets per teenager. So I was very disciplined in how I worked.
That's quite a few sheets.
4? Really?
No, as in overall.
Oh, it was a lot overall. Yeah. I was going to my lab in Bayer, and they were like, wow, because I was turning up with, like 30, 40 dart slides or whatever. So it was a lot overall, yes. It was. I dread to think how much that cost, but thankfully I got reimbursed some of it through the Taylor Wessing. So that was an example of just having a little seed of an idea, because I have a lot of ideas. Obviously I don't act on all my ideas, or it's just not possible. And sometimes I will start projects and they won't work out, or I won't pursue them. And I think that's very kind of usual in photography as well. But that one I just got a real momentum to it. And, it gave me a purpose during that time as well, certainly. And it kind of, in a sense, it like elevated these kids or these teenagers who were having they'd never experienced that kind of camera before. They were used to like selfies and selfie sticks, and it was quite a quiet experience. I'd like turn up on my own with my camera, with my tripod. We'd find their backyard or a local park if they didn't have a garden. We'd spend some time together. I'd chat and kind of build a bit of a relationship, and then I'd take four shots and then choose one of them.
What made you decide for it to be in black and white and not color?
Well, I mean, nearly all my recent work has been in black and white.
Yes.
And I suppose in a way that kind of refers back to my very first times with photography, which was working in black and white film and being in the darkroom. But there's also, I suppose, a kind of beauty and abstractiveness, in a sense, that I love about black and white, and a sense that you don't know. Maybe, I suppose, from some of the Lost Summer, you can kind of perhaps tell that they're modern day teenagers, but certainly with Voto and Gli Isolani, there's some shots in there that I feel could have been taken 50 years ago, even 100 years ago. Obviously, if that was a colour with vivid colours, and this kind of strong sense of, like, I suppose, reality, if you like, you would know that was taken in a more contemporary time. So there's something about, I feel like sometimes with black and white, it's a little bit like stepping out of time into a different world, and it allows your imagination, I feel, to kind of become more vivid in some ways. So that's some of the reasons I enjoy black and white. Yeah.
Fair enough. And you mentioned that of the 44 portraits you took, some were stronger than the others. What makes a stronger portrait for you?
I think it's partly the relationship I have with the subject.
Right.
It's how they kind of respond. I often give, I suppose, very kind of gentle directions. So it's how they respond to that. I mean, in terms of Lost Summer, there was just a kind of vulnerability to some of them that I felt made it a more interesting portrait than others. The way they stood, the way they held themselves, their kind of deportment.
Right.
And I suppose there's also the kind of, it's very much talked about, but this gaze. So this, you know, how they're kind of viewing you and you're viewing them, and that kind of exchange.
Right.
It's really hard because it's very difficult. You can't kind of do a checklist of what makes a great portrait, I don't think.
No.
But there's just capturing the essence of someone or a small part of them. And I think with some of the teenagers, it was more successful than others. But I quite easily or quite quickly knew. So for instance, I would essentially get back one contact sheet for each of the teenagers I photographed with the 4 shots on.
Right.
Whoops. And I quite easily knew, or quite quickly knew, it was quite easy for me to decide which one of those often was the one that worked or which was the strongest.
Right.
And it was about, it was how they held themselves, their gaze, how I connected with them, and just capturing something that was, I'm not attempting to like tell you everything about this person from a portrait.
Right.
But I think a good portrait or a strong portrait kind of makes you want to know more.
Right.
Even if you never find out more, you know. But it's something that kind of draws you in slightly.
Oh, what's the story here,
Yeah, you want to know the story.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that usually how you work with your other projects as well? When you're photographing people, you want to spend some time together with them before you...
I mean, often. Sometimes I suppose I do kind of slightly more street photography where it's much more fleeting. Well, as fleeting as it can be with that camera.
Right.
I mean, you can't work quickly with that.
No.
If you do, you mess it up.
Yes.
People have to be aware that this is going to take some time.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I suppose if you've already got the camera up, someone's walking past, you could approach them, but it's still going to be a few minutes. It's not going to be, 2 seconds.
Right.
So building some kind of rapport and establishing some kind of relationship, even if it's quite a fleeting one, to me is really important. And often, particularly, well, actually all my projects really, very few of them have been people I've just found on the street.
Right.
I mean, some of the pilgrims I encountered, but I would, talk to them about their faith. I would talk to them about why they were there. I would explain my camera, because suddenly I'm turning up with this weird looking object that they've never seen before. So actually, because people were in this often kind of contemplative space, particularly with the pilgrimage project, they were very open to having like deeper, wider conversations.
Right. Right.
And I was doing research for my MA, so I would also make notes. So I suppose each project varies, but I don't tend to do, I suppose when I'm making a portrait, that it tends to be more than just clicking the shutter and saying thank you,
Right.
It's a bit more than that, I think.
No, of course. The Gli Isolani that you mentioned, that's another book that I have of yours. Again, beautiful
thank
book.
You.
So how did that one come about?
So that one, so that's the one which is taken mostly in Sicily and Sardinia, so Italian islands. Well, that came about because actually I'd been sent to Venice years ago for the TimeOut guide. So I'd spent like a month in Venice, which is clearly a very, very beautiful city, but has been photographed like endlessly. It's difficult to do anything original in Venice. But there was a moment, I remember I'd been sent to photograph a cemetery island called San Michele. So it's actually an island that is a cemetery that kind of sits on its own in the Venetian lagoon. So really atmospheric.
Yeah.
A lot of the things on the list were more like what you would expect, St. Mark's Square and, I don't know, Rialto and like classic things. But this was a bit more interesting to me. And I remember getting the vaporetto, so you have to get the boat over, obviously.
Right.
And I was waiting there to get the boat with my camera, and there were lots of Venetians there kind of clutching flowers, and it was a very misty morning.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this is this interesting journey they're making. So they're going over to this cemetery island to essentially, lay down flowers for their loved ones on the graves. And I found it very, very moving. So that stayed with me for about 15 years, that idea of photographing Venetians on this journey.
Yeah.
So Gli Isolani started as that, but then I quickly realised that, first of all, Venetians are really private people.
Okay.
They're also absolutely sick of having people with cameras and tourists, and it's been so documented, their city. So they are not very open to being photographed, particularly, if they're in a moment of grief. And I really struggled with how this would work. And also I struggled with what kind of gives me the right to photograph people from a different city. I don't speak the language, or I don't speak it well. People who are, potentially having, difficult moments, like why am I doing this? I suppose I started really questioning my kind of own integrity and my idea.
Right.
Then I started looking into kind of events that happened in Venice, like festivities and carnivals, but I didn't want to do the classic kind of Venice carnival with all the masks. That then led me to the south of Italy and the islands of Italy. And then it was then that I kind of discovered through my research that there are these big celebrations and festivals that happen throughout, particularly Sicily and Sardinia, that are often based on kind of paganism or folklore, but they're also wrapped up in ideas of faith and the seasons changing, and discovered that these incredible costumes and masks that they wear.
Yes.
And then I kind of thought, right, maybe I need to forget about Venice, or it became a very small part of the project, and try and adjust the project so that it becomes kind of about these kind of almost transformative moments when local villagers become characters, become other characters. They put on these costumes, they put on these masks.
Right.
And they become these kind of anthropomorphic, like half animal, half man often. And it's a really big deal for the community, and it's a really important part of a kind of ritual in their calendars. And that's when I discovered that there were many of these that happened, particularly in Sicily and Sardinia. So that's how the idea kind of came about. So a lot of my projects come through research, a lot of my long-term projects. Wow. He starts off with one thing and then changes.
15 years later.
Yeah, exactly. Changes into something completely different. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. I think it's important to be open to that as well and not hold on to what it was when you started.
Yeah, it's difficult to do that sometimes, because sometimes you have this idea in your head of how a project's going to evolve or how it could look.
Right.
And I think that can be quite, not dangerous exactly, but I think that's not always a good thing to do, because then you're inevitably going to be disappointed. But I think what I find through research, and whether I'm looking at literature or I'm looking at poetry or I'm reading the news or I'm digging through the internet, that you discover many, many more things, many more layers. And sometimes your original idea can become something even stronger or even more interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm always making notes and sketches and writing down influences and things like that.
Yeah. But then how do you reel it back into a body of work if you keep going on when, new influences or new ideas come through?
Well, I mean, for me, the research kind of enriches what I already have as an idea. So an idea will sometimes emerge through the research, but then at that point, I kind of think, right, am I actually going to go anywhere with this idea, or is it just going to sit in a sketchbook or notebook? Right. So that was when I decided, for instance, with Gli Isolani, right, I think this is an interesting idea. It's been done before. I was aware I wasn't going to be the first person to be photographing these costumes and masks in Italy. It has been done before.
Right.
But I want to do it in my way. And I think you have to accept that to a degree, everything's been done before in photography.
Yeah.
Some of these festivities, even in these tiny villages, they've been documented by photographers. But when I did my research, it was mainly that photographers had documented them in a much more kind of classic documentary way. Right. And I wanted to do it in a much kind of slower way. And actually what happened was, this is where the pandemic also really helped me in a weird kind of way, because originally I was going to turn up with someone helping me, because I don't speak the language. These are very kind of closed communities, so you need to have a local person with you.
Yeah.
The idea was that I was going to turn up to the actual festivities. So a lot of them took place in Easter, for instance, Settimana Santa, which is their Holy Week, because a lot of the rituals are related to kind of the Catholic faith. So the idea was that, first of all, I would turn up to these villages in Easter and try and photograph the participants. Right. But they all got cancelled. Yeah. So actually what I ended up doing, which was a very different way of working for me, was I worked with a brilliant kind of, she's actually a documentary film producer, but she's from Palermo in Sicily. And I identified the communities I really would like to photograph, and she got in touch with them and actually set up portrait shoots with each of the communities dressed up in the outfits they would have worn for the festivities.
Wow.
But it actually worked out much better, because I think Arsenal have won. There's loads of fireworks
Oh,
going
well
off. I don't know. I have to look after. It actually worked out much better because it meant I had way more control. Because what I realised was a lot of these celebrations and festivities are actually completely chaotic. So there's fireworks going off, there's boozing, there's fire pits. I mean, it's a huge event. And it would have been very, very difficult to work with that camera if I'd turned up when they were actually happening. So it actually worked out much better. I had much more control over locations. I could really take my time. So I ended up going on a kind of road trip with Giovanna, who was this kind of producer who helped me. And we would each day, she built an itinerary, we built one together. So each day we would travel to a different village in Sicily or Sardinia, turn up, do a little recce of the locations. And then it was very funny. It was interesting because you would have these, a mixture of generations, mixture of genders, these kind of, I suppose, quite ordinary looking villagers turning up in their normal clothes. And then they were like, oh, we're just going to go and get changed. And then they'd emerge with like antlers coming out of their heads. They'd emerge with like cowbells. They'd have their faces like darkened with soot. They'd have like a kind of weird, scary mask on. So they became these other people, these other characters. And then I would be able to kind of direct them and control them to a degree. So the photographs are kind of very performative in some ways. But also if you look through the book, for instance, you'll notice that I very deliberately excluded any sign of modernity. So, you know, you're not going to get like someone with a mobile phone in the background. You're not going to get even a modern looking kind of cafe, or I'm focused on the kind of the crumbling walls. I'm focused on the kind of the fields and the bucolic landscape, or the rural sense of the landscape, because the kind of fertility of the land is so important to a lot of these rituals. So that was a deliberate decision. So you know, if I got a moped speeding through, I'd be like, right, forget it, you know, we'll move on somewhere else. So I had to really be quite decisive and take control of those situations, because I knew, because I wanted them to look like they're out of a kind of fairy tale or a storybook, or they've stepped out of time, that if you did have, I don't know, any sign of modernity, that would kind of ruin the kind of it would ruin the atmosphere of the picture.
It's a fascinating book and there is sort of, for me at least, like every image stands on its own as well, apart from being a part of this bigger body of work, and it felt like there was room for like this mystery for you to like sit at with this image and wonder about what is going on here.
Well, that's what I really hope, that they kind of evoke, a sense of intrigue and mystery and wonder, where you're thinking, because some of them are pretty weird. Like you're kind of thinking, hang on, what's this all about? And that's also, they do have captions, and there's a very beautiful essay that was written by a Italian curator and critic. But you never know, you never get like the whole story. Like I don't say, right, this represents this and that and that, and this takes place at this time. Like the information's there if you want to find it online. But you're right, like I want, you know, sometimes it's the things that you don't say that almost make something more interesting, or it takes your imagination to kind of other places. So you start imagining, who are these characters and where have they come from and who's behind the mask, and you know. So I don't always want to give too much away with my photography. I think it's important that there is that sense of kind of wonder there.
And you shot this in how many days?
Oh, well, it was 3 or 4 trips over 2 years. So my projects are never quick.
No, that's fair.
But a lot of also coming back reflect. So like I think Sicily was 2 weeks, Sardinia was 2 weeks, the Venetian Lagoon was like 2 trips of a week each. Yeah, quite condensed. But then after each trip, I would come back, see what worked, what didn't work. You know. But it was really, I mean, that was actually the trip to Sardinia particularly was really hard work, because it was also really. It was very hot. It was hard working with that camera. I was up a mountain, like balanced on a rock, you know. It was going to a different location every day. So it was very intense making that work. I
bet. And in terms of putting it all together, sequencing the images, how long did that take?
I certainly had an idea of kind of my favorites, or the ones that I felt worked the best, or that were the strongest images. But with the Gli Isolani project, I worked very closely with the guy who runs Ghost Books, called Stu, who's like the design director, or he started Ghost. Well, he's got quite an interesting way of working. So I'll come to him, I'll say I've got this new project, Gli Isolani. He also published Voto, and I'll say to him, here's like 80 pictures, this is my edit. And he'll say, I don't want to see your edit, I want to see everything. And you're like, oh gosh. So then I have to show him every contact sheet, including all the duff ones that didn't work out, you know. And then from that, he does a kind of wider edit, probably of maybe 200 images. I mean, don't forget, I didn't shoot thousands of images because I'm shooting on large format. There was maybe only, I say only, I don't even know, 500 maybe, for instance, that I shot over these 2 years. But I would then do like printouts, like just black and white copies, cheap printouts. And I would get together with Stu and we would lay them out together like on a big floor of like my studio or his studio, start moving them around and then beginning to build a sequence and a narrative. And the idea, some of it's very instinctual for me, but the idea that he came up with was that he wanted you to kind of move through these different worlds. So you start by the sea, which is obviously also very important to the identity of islanders because you're surrounded by the water, you're surrounded by the sea, and then you kind of move up to the cobbled streets of the town, and then you'd move back down to the mountains. So it kind of takes you through these different landscapes. So that was the kind of I suppose that was the arc for building a photographic narrative. And with Voto, he started with a much more abstract image, I suppose, and with Gli Isolani, he went straight in with quite a bold image of these two guys with kind of masks and sheepskins. So you kind of understand to an extent, okay, this is like, quite surreal. You're entering this slightly surreal world from the beginning. But he's a really good person to work with. He's a very talented designer and he's got a great eye for kind of building a narrative.
Yeah, that's always helpful when you find someone that knows what they're doing, but also you have a good relationship with in like a working relationship.
Well, it's hard to do on your own because you're so close to the work as well. And also I find with photography projects, you have your own favorites and those are not always images that should actually be in the final edit. But because you've got a particular, I don't know, kind of soft spot for someone you photographed, or you remember how you felt at the time when you made that picture, you have a very, very subjective view of it. And that's not always helpful when it comes to editing. So bringing someone else in, I think, is always a very kind of important part of the process.
Yeah. Are there examples of images that you loved or that were, you know, you had a great experience making but didn't end up in the book?
For Voto, yes. There's one guy particularly, a portrait I took of a guy called Joe in Ireland. And I really wanted that to go in, but that was partly because he's like invited me into, I mean, he's in his 80s, he'd invited me into his home, I'd met his entire family, they'd taken me for fish and chips, he'd given me like his homemade like lethal alcoholic kind of poutine thing. You know, you all these things, you're kind of tied up in all these other stories. But in the end, Stu was like, it doesn't really fit with the other portraits of pilgrims. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And it's sad, but you know, he didn't care, but I sent him a nice print and we stayed in touch. So ultimately, I think it's easy to get wrapped up in the you become quite nostalgic about certain images you make and you remember the great time you had when you met that person. It doesn't mean it's a great portrait though.
Right.
Or it doesn't mean that it fits with the overall edit.
The overall work, yeah. Has anyone seen that portrait?
It ended up in the local press in Ireland and he absolutely loved it. He loved it because he's like a local celebrity. So it all worked out. And I did a really nice community exhibition in Ireland in his tiny little village. And everyone came along and he was a big part of that. So so it all worked out fine. But there was an initial, oh no, I don't want to lose Joe. But I understood why. And actually the edit is much stronger as a result.
Right, of course. Cool. What are you working on now?
So I am working on a new photographic project based in Napoli in the south of Italy.
Wow.
Which is about kind of superstition and luck and magic to a degree, I suppose. Mostly in black and white, large format, but there's also some colour. I don't know if that will stay in the edit. I don't know. But
colour? You're shooting colour as well?
Some, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. We'll have to see if that actually makes it into the final edit.
Fair.
And then something I've been working on for 6 years is this big feature film, Mother Vera, which is my first kind of foray into filmmaking a moving image really, but that came about because I met this incredible nun when I was photographing ex voto, who had this extremely enigmatic and captivating presence, and she almost who she was kind of demanded that it wasn't just a portrait. I mean, the portrait of her I kind of made is probably one of the strongest images I feel in the series.
Yes.
But she invited me and my assistant at the time, who actually is a filmmaker and became my co-director on the film, to stay with her at her convent in Belarus.
Did you say sister or assistant?
Assistant. Yeah,
okay.
but my sister. She was my assistant on Ex Voto, but she's a really talented filmmaker.
Right.
So we ended up co-directing this documentary feature film about her kind of extraordinary and kind of quite bonkers in some ways life, and spent a lot of time at a convent in Belarus, and that's just been finished, so that's now playing at festivals. That was a very different experience, making a film.
Do you see yourself making more documentary films?
I think,
or films
I think only, like, the reason that was made was because I met this one woman and she kind of had this incredible effect on me, in that I knew she had more stories to tell, and it was difficult to tell those stories just through the medium of photography.
Right.
So maybe if I met someone else and I felt the same way about them, perhaps, so it would become a kind of a portrait study, I guess, of someone.
Yeah.
But in longer form, obviously, with sound and with moving image. So, but I'm not thinking I'm now going to be a documentary filmmaker. I feel like that was potentially a kind of one-off.
Yeah.
And a very serendipitous encounter that led to much more than just one kind of photograph. But I'm not shutting it down. We'll see. I don't know. But it was a very hard process, and the funding with documentary film is also extremely hard.
Yes.
Obviously, you're working with a bigger team, so you have to be working with other people. You're not just reliant on yourself, which is brilliant in some ways, but can also present new challenges.
Yeah.
But the film is shot very much kind of in the style, I suppose, of Ex Voto. So there's it's black and white.
Right.
There's lots of still, kind of quiet shots. It's again a sense of being in this other world, because we were in this kind of mesmeric like convent in Belarus, which was unlike anywhere I've ever been before. So it's definitely an extension, kind of aesthetically, of the work I'd already done.
Yeah.
For Ex Voto particularly.
Right. In terms of the process with the documentary film, I mean, you already had this relationship with this person that you photographed. How did the meet of shoot happen? Like, did you have a plan on what you were going to shoot, or were there conversations first and then
for the documentary?
Yeah.
So initially I went with Cecile, my co-director, for a week, and that was because we got some money from Sony through the Sony prize, and they gave us, I got a Sony camera, so we shot it all on Sony.
Nice.
We went for a week not really knowing what to expect, because I'd never lived in a convent before. I'd never been to that part of the world before either, so it was very kind of new to me. So we went for a week, and we documented. In that first trip, we documented what was happening around us. So how Vera, the protagonist, how she integrated with the other nuns, like her daily routine. We documented the prayers. We documented the kind of beautiful music and the chanting. We documented the farm where she ended up living for some of the time. So we kind of followed what was around us, really. As he went on more trips, because we ended up going maybe 5 or 6 times over many years, we obviously got to know her better. We built up more trust, and that's when she revealed lots of things about her past that we hadn't been aware of when we first met her. So it turns out she'd had this kind of completely unconventional, like, wild life before she joined the convent.
Wow.
So that's in the film. So she narrates it, and then we ended up, there were a couple of times that she would do something and we'd ask her to do it again, for instance, because we hadn't quite got the right shot. And then there were some shots that, they weren't constructed because they occurred, but we needed to construct them under slightly different circumstances.
Right.
So there's a mixture of, I suppose, more kind of handheld, fluid, almost fly-on-the-wall shots, and then these very studied kind of vignettes that almost feel like still photographs.
Yeah.
But it's a documentary. It's about it's about a real person and their real experiences and the real environment they were in. So, but some of it feels like fiction, I suppose, in the way it's shot, even though it's not, because I suppose it's kind of very arty in some ways, maybe not too arty, but you know, there's an element of us directing how it looks, that was very deliberate,
right,
and very kind of purposeful.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm excited to watch it. What I know it's in the festival circuit now. What's the plan for it to be?
So the plan is, at the moment, it's playing at festivals. So it's at the London Film Festival next month in October, and then it's also going to other festivals in the UK and in Europe and in America. And then we're hoping in 2025, early 2025, that we can have a kind of, it'll be a small but a theatrical release, so that it will play at more cinemas across the UK, kind of independent cinemas. So we might do a run of like 15 or 20 screenings across the UK, including more in London. And then maybe streaming, but we don't know yet. There's a lot of negotiation with streaming platforms, and that we've got a producer who kind of mainly deals with that. But it would be great to obviously be able to share it with as many people as possible. But I don't think it's ever going to be on Netflix.
I mean,
it's not. I'm pretty certain it's never going to be on Netflix.
Okay.
It's a little bit too obscure for Netflix, but there are other platforms that it could end up on. So we're not counting out.
Mubi,
we've been in touch a bit with Mubi. It would sit. It's listed on there, but it's not. Yeah, we're in touch with people at Mubi. That would be a platform that would kind of suit that style of filmmaking. So certainly there are other options out there.
Yeah, and I'm sure you can put it on its own website, and people would buy it.
Yeah, there's ways of doing it for sure. So we need to, once the kind of theatrical runs out the way, that's when we need to really think about ways of distributing it. And we might also get a distributor on board. So we'll see. At the moment, we're in the middle of doing kind of a festival run. So
exciting stuff.
It is exciting.
The other photography project you mentioned, are you okay to talk about it?
Sure. Yeah.
Do you have a time frame in mind, or is it just?
So I've been so far 3 times in, I'm trying to think how long that's been, maybe a year and a half. I've done 3 trips to Napoli for it.
Right.
I think, my projects are never quick. And also I've had a lot to do with the film. I've had to really commit to the kind of film schedule.
Right.
So I haven't had endless time or money to go back to Napoli.
Yeah.
I'm hoping it's quite a big project, because it involves, I have to take 90 images for the final project. Because it involves this particular superstition that involves 90 images. So it's quite a big project. I'm hoping in a couple of years.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but who knows? I'm trying. I don't really want to rush things.
Right.
And if it takes me 2 years to have another book and finish a project, that's fine. I prefer to do a smaller number of projects and really be considered about them and take my time with them, rather than try and bash out, another project to have another book. So hopefully in a couple of years.
It is easy, especially with the current situation we're in, to get into the mindset of how quickly can we do something and moving on to the next. Where do you think the sort of groundedness comes from for you, where the project's going to take however long it takes, and I'm going to let it happen?
Partly through the large format camera.
Right.
Because obviously working with that camera, you can't be rushed. You're working... you're working at a certain pace that is restrictive,
Right.
So that it slows down the entire process for sure.
Right.
So partly that. And I also think, I don't know, I feel like I see a lot of projects that could be really great, but I feel they've been rushed or they've been put together too quickly and they haven't had enough thought. And I think it's really important, for me anyway, with photography projects, I need to step back from them as well. And I need to revisit things, and I need to give myself space to like reflect on what I've already done. So if I'm just like working, shooting, I think you don't really give yourself that opportunity to see what's working and what isn't, and you don't really allow new ideas to emerge. So for me, kind of taking my time is crucial, because I think otherwise you can miss opportunities or miss ideas, and you don't really allow it to have the space it needs to develop.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like I'm working on a board project that I mentioned with you earlier, and I'm struggling with that as well, because it's gonna be 2 years and a bit since I started it. But in terms of the amount of hours I've spent on it, not a lot. Maybe a few days.
Yeah.
And
a few days is nothing.
It's nothing.
For a big project. Often,
yeah, maybe
or
a couple of
long-term
weeks
project.
I would say overall,
Yeah.
but still I feel like I'm still in research phase.
But that's fine.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of, like you kind of mentioned, there's a lot of pressure we put on ourselves to be productive, producing. But sometimes it's as important to step back and give yourself some space and time. And sometimes like this project, I'll have left it for 6 months or so without giving it that much thought, and then I'll go back into that kind of zone where I'll get back into it and I'll be kind of re-energized and excited about it again. Because what you don't want is it to become a chore. Then you kind of lose your interest, you lose your passion for it. You need to kind of bring back that something that really compels you to go back out there. So so for me, I think the kind of slow and steady approach when it comes to making work works. And also the themes I'm tackling are not straightforward. Like, they're complicated, they've got many layers, they've got a lot of depth, and in order for me to understand those projects as much as I can, I need time to read, to educate myself, to think. And I think without that, I wouldn't really understand why I was making this work.
So you talked about the difficulties in getting funding for projects. For someone wanting to get into long form projects, what would be your advice in terms of funding?
It's just really hard. I mean, my advice would honestly be for photographers to have some kind of vocation that they can fall back on, or have a part-time. I mean, you'd be surprised at the amount of well-known photographers and artists who aren't just working as photographers and artists. You know, they're doing other jobs to survive. The funding is really tricky. I mean, I'm probably not a good person to ask because I don't seem to be very good at getting funding. But partly because there's just not much of it about. So like Arts Council do something called Develop Your Creative Practice that I know quite a few artists who have got. But to apply for that, and I think it's up to £12,000 now, you have to come up with something that is completely different. So you can't just say, I want this money to continue with this project I've already started. But you can say, I want to learn how to edit sound, or I want to learn how to, I don't know, make photography that's camera obscura or pinhole, or do something completely different from your current practice. But that's not very helpful if you're on a long-term project and you know the kind of trajectory of the project, I suppose. I mean, I use the commercial work that I do, which isn't always exciting or glamorous or even that interesting, but I appreciate that work and I value that work because it allows me to make the work I really want to do. I mean, there are some more kind of obscure funding grants you can get, but they are very few and far between. And there are some websites that kind of list the grants available, but there just aren't very many, particularly in the UK, sadly. So it's a case of often using other means and other sources to fund your work if you really want to be committed to long-term projects. I mean, I make it harder for myself because I shoot on film. Large format film.
On large format,
So I'm making it much more expensive, and that is sadly a consideration now, like whether I can actually afford to keep shooting in that way. So
you might change up, either go to a smaller format or change the medium.
I mean, it pains me to say it because I love working with that camera, and I think differently when I work with that camera. I feel like the images and the photographs I make have something to them that is still lacking for me when I use a digital camera. But it's a practical consideration now in a way that it didn't used to be. So for sure, like even buying film now, I buy my film from New York and get it shipped because it's cheaper than buying it here, which is mad, really, you know?
A lot cheaper. Yeah, it's crazy how cheap it is there.
I've gone back in the darkroom. Maybe I'll start processing my own work. I'm printing my own work a bit more, which can save money. But, you know, it's an expensive medium and it's an expensive way to work.
But
I also feel like this is what I want to be doing. I don't want to have to stop working in the way I want to work because of film prices, or, you know, I kind of feel that's not fair. In a sense.
No.
But I don't know. We'll see. Maybe as technology develops, but I just can't imagine shooting the projects I shoot and instantaneously having the image, because part of the kind of pull for me is not knowing quite what you're getting, and that's when beautiful mistakes can happen, and that's when you can surprise yourself, and that's when that's when this level of unexpectedness can appear, and that's all lost if you're seeing exactly what you're getting in that moment.
True. And I know some photographers are very particular about the image being technically perfect. And shooting film sort of already has some element of, like you mentioned, you don't quite know what you're getting, and there can be beautiful mistakes. But were there images that had or didn't satisfy technically 100%, but still made it into your projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think shooting, particularly on large format, particularly kind of wide open with the lens, you know, like you're taking a risk.
Yeah.
And not every image is going to be 100% pin sharp. And also it's a different sharpness to digital. Like it's a different tone, it's a different it's a different way of image making altogether. So I think you have to be careful not to compare as well images you shoot on film and digital, because digital is almost ultra real in some ways, or it can be.
Of course.
But yeah, I mean, the picture I took of Vera, I've got it over there, Vera the nun, who then became the main protagonist of the film, when it's blown up really big, there is a tiny bit of movement there. And I know there is movement because I had to shoot it at 1/8 of a second in a forest. I mean,
1/8 of a second?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it was on a tripod, but that's still a slow shutter speed, you know?
Yeah. For a portrait, absolutely.
So, and you can get away with it, I suppose, when it's that big. When it's blown out really big, you see that. But also, I'm not someone who tends to manipulate files afterwards. So, yes, I get my negatives scanned.
Yeah.
But I don't kind of go mad with sharpening, or I don't go mad with retouching.
Don't use AI tools to
Don't use AI, no. So, yeah, it's frustrating to me. I want to be technically as perfect as I can be, but I also feel if there's an image that's really strong, there's an image that kind of speaks to you or emotes something or resonates in some way.
Yeah.
If it's not technically absolutely perfect, I will forsake that.
Right.
For something that touches you in other ways, you know.
Yeah.
So for me, yes, being technically competent, of course, is important.
Of course,
and I've got a certain way I work. I'm confident with the way I work. I have one lens. I have one camera. It's a very simple setup. Like, but I also feel that we can get too caught up in the kind of technicalities and whether something is 100% sharp at 100%, you know, like I'm not so worried about that. I look at photographers like, I don't know, Sally Mann, Judith Joy Ross, who use large format. A lot of their images are way off in focus, but actually there's another element to the images that makes it irrelevant whether they're in focus or not. And I think, this is a bit of a generalization, but I think there's a trait in certain male photographers when you start looking at large format like forums and getting into that whole world where they're so tied up in the technical aspects and they want to, you know, blow up an image to like 500% and check and I just think if it's not a good portrait, it's not a good portrait. I don't care if it's like a tiny bit out actually, because what that image is kind of how it's connecting with me emotionally, to me, is much more important than whether it's technically what we consider to be perfect. Sure. So yeah, I mean, you know, you look through my books and I think they all look like they're in focus, and they are in focus. But if you were to blow up every one of those images to like huge life size, there would be some that are probably a tiny bit softer at times. Yeah. But I don't care now. I just think for me that's not important. It's important, but I wouldn't discount an image because of it if it gives you something else.
Yeah. And to your point, like that is one of the strongest portraits of Mother Vera in that book. Yeah. Okay, so you've been doing this for a long time. How would you say you've evolved as a photographer? And what are some of the key takeaways for you, like over when you look at your journey to take forward?
I mean, I've become older, obviously. But I also think that with age comes a level of, not always, but some level of maturity and some kind of enhanced idea of who we are as humans and where our place is in the world. And when I look at projects like Voto, my pilgrimage project, I just think I wouldn't have made that work when I was 22. Like I couldn't have. I wasn't at the right place I didn't understand if you like, the human condition in the way that I do now,
Right.
I don't think I would have achieved what I achieved with that project, like at a much younger age. So I suppose some of my kind of evolving as a photographer is to do with, getting older and being more, I would hope, more learned and more educated and finding my way through the world in a way that I didn't really know how to do when I was in my early 20s, I suppose. So I think that's become a big part of it. And I think as I've matured, my work has certainly matured, I would hope. But how else have I evolved? Well, I found, I don't mean to bang on about large format the whole time, but I have found a medium that I love and that works for me and that works for my subject matters. And of course, that camera isn't right for every project and it's not right for every photographer. But for me, I can't imagine making the work I make on a different format. So that's something, that discovery for me was a big turning point in my practice, certainly. So that's been very important to how I've evolved as a photographer. And I think I'm just much more like, it sounds like quite basic, but recently I've really discovered my love for reading and literature, and that helps me with the way I think about projects, how I think about potentially new projects. It gives me ideas. So I'm now reading a lot of fiction that I probably wasn't 20 years ago. And I'm really, really enjoying that. And I'm finding that my brain's, it's kind of inspiring things in my brain and the way I think. So that's really helping as well. It's very hard. Photography is so competitive and it's very hard to always keep going, to get that motivation, to get that inspiration. But I think it's just sometimes small things. Like I might just watch a film and there might be one scene from a film and I just think, wow, it just kind of blows me away how beautifully it's shot, for instance. And then that'll make me then think about my own work. And I suppose I'm kind of very, open and curious, and I get my ideas from lots of different places. And I think, being older and being more mature and being more critical of my work as well, I think. Like, I feel like maybe when I was younger, I was a bit afraid to be critical of my own work. And I think now I can be quite a harsh critic of but in a way that drives me. And
constructive.
It's constructive. And also I've now built up, I'm lucky because I've got a network of really great photography friends in London, for instance. And I think getting advice and viewpoints from your friends in the creative industries, and they can be really generous, it can be a very generous place to be, and they can, it can really enhance the way you think about your own work. And it's very easy to become tied up in yourself with photography, and I think sometimes you've got to look beyond yourself and your projects and kind of seek advice and opinions from other people. That's really valuable to me now, and that's something that took time to build as well. But I actually think the photography community is a lot more open and generous than you would imagine. Not always, but it can be, certainly.
No, I agree with that. Initially I was closed off to, maybe closed off is a strong word, but I wasn't seeking relationships in the sort of space that I was working in. But once I started making connections and making friends and having these conversations, it could be about work, it could be about something else, but to have this common thread around which you have a relationship, I found that to be enriching as well.
I agree.
Like I could be feeling shitty about my work, for example, and go and have a conversation with a fellow photographer or a YouTuber, for lack of a better word, and would come away feeling refreshed and motivated.
It's really important. And you're not looking for validation all the time. It's not helpful if your friends are just like, whatever you do, oh, it's brilliant. It's amazing. Like, you need people to go, well, maybe that image doesn't work, but hang on, there's something really interesting about this image, and maybe that's a direction to try. And actually, in kind of reference to your earlier question about, I suppose, surviving as a photography, so now I do quite a lot of teaching, and I'm doing a lot of mentoring, and I'm really enjoying the mentoring, because I think there's a lot of photographers out there who are feeling quite lost, and they don't know the direction to go in. They don't know how to get there. They don't know how to find their way. They find their direction. And I'm finding it for myself, like it's very rewarding for myself. But I've also seen great kind of changes in the way that people have started viewing their work and making their work. And that's really enriching for me to see that sometimes people just need a little nudge, or they need just a different way of thinking about their work that can open up new kind of possibilities.
100%.
So I've been enjoying that as well.
Oh, that's beautiful. So mentoring and then also teaching?
So I mean, I'm a kind of visiting lecturer at a few different universities. So it's not a permanent job, but I kind of go in and I'll do lectures or I'll give crits and work with students who are currently studying photography.
Yeah. Have you, or are you interested in doing like workshops outside?
Yeah, I've done some workshops as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done Photofilmic, quite a big organisation. I've done Photofilmic.
Yeah.
I've done workshops at universities and some kind of private workshops as well. So I really enjoy that because it can be, photography can be a very lonesome practice. So having a network of other creatives, going out into the kind of real world, because sometimes we can get quite stuck in our brains. So going out and interacting with other people and learning from them and them learning from you. I enjoyed that aspect of kind of that educational aspect of it as well.
True. A recent photo book or movie or anything else that you found to be interesting and inspiring, want to recommend to others?
I should have thought about this. Let me think. There's a very beautiful book by my friend called Lydia Goldblatt called Fugue, which is about her time documenting her family. They live in North London as well, during the pandemic.
Right.
But they're quite abstract, some of the images. They're extremely emotive. And she also writes very well about her experience of being a mother, but also being in this kind of fractured environment during the pandemic, or this sense of not knowing, what's going to happen next. I mean, there certainly doesn't look like a kind of lockdown project at all.
Right.
But they're very subtle, the images, in many ways, but they're very kind of revealing at the same time. So that's a very beautiful book. That's published by Gost as well.
Nice.
And film-wise, the Wim Wenders Perfect Day film.
Perfect Days.
Yeah.
Oh, gorgeous film.
It's a lovely, and I love it because it's quite it was very understated in many ways.
Yeah.
And it's about the very simple routine of toilet cleaner in Japan. But it tells you a lot about, well, not just about him, but about the world around him and the way he thinks and the way he absorbs himself in these very simple moments that are very meaningful for him.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very beautiful, it's a very, in some ways it's simple, but it's actually got many layers and a lot of depth.
Totally.
And again, it's kind of about how we navigate our way through the world and what's important to us.
Yeah.
And it's a really beautiful, moving film.
Yeah. No, 100%.
Yeah.
I did remember thinking after a few minutes in, with sort of looking at the routine is not the movie. It's whatever else is happening in him.
Yeah.
It did, you're right. It did.
And of course, photography plays a big part in how he lives his life.
Yes.
And that was lovely to see that as well. So that I think it's a gentle film.
Yeah.
It's a very gentle film, but it's very touching at the same time. Yeah.
Yes.
So that was something that I think kind of stayed with me recently.
Oh, beautiful. I'm glad that I see that one. It's a good movie. Last question. What does success mean to you?
Well, it's difficult because I think there's not really one answer for that. I mean, I suppose I could consider myself lucky because I've won some big awards. So if you count success as having exposure through awards and competitions, then I could say that I've done quite well through that.
Right.
And that's some level of success. But I suppose ultimate success for me is continuing to make work that's meaningful to me, but that also resonates with other people and that is meaningful to other people.
Right.
Actually, although the competitions and the accolades and the awards are kind of nice, although I think my time's probably run out with those. I don't think I'm going to have any more success with those.
Why do you think so?
I find I've got a very funny relationship with competitions. I think a lot of them are completely pointless and they're money-making businesses. There are certain organisations that seem to run back-to-back competitions where you have to pay a lot to enter for a start, which I really object to.
Yeah.
And the prizes are really not that great, and they're awarding something different, like they're awarding 20 photographers every month. I don't know. I just don't think like they're great and a great experience for the people who enter them. I don't think
Right.
they're offering what they should. But yeah, for
Fair
me,
enough.
success is more about people engaging with my work and being moved by it and being touched by it, and maybe my work might even open up a different world to people that they hadn't really thought about before. So making work that is thought-provoking and that is kind of educating people and inspiring them, but also, yeah, inspiring this kind of sense of wonder about the world. I think that to me is what success is. And
Yeah.
I'm quite realistic that not every project's going to do that, and that also, you know, my work's not going to connect with everybody. You know, I understand that. But if it can just connect with some people and make a little bit of difference to the way they think and the way they even live, then to me that's a successful way of living. And that's when my work, I think, has hit a certain level that I would consider to be successful.
That's all I have.
Yeah, okay.
But thank you so much for doing this.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's great. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, not at all.